Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Today's a day of celebration. It's also a celebration that's landing in the midst of a very, very challenging time for us and for our country. In Politico, just yesterday, it was reported right before Shabbat that violent hate crimes in Los Angeles hit the highest level that they have seen in more than a decade, with white supremacist acts jumping 38%. And I read earlier this week that 50% of the president's supporters believe the dangerous, baseless conspiracy theories of QAnon. If you're not familiar with QAnon at this point, then first count yourself lucky, but also you should look it up and see what they claim and why that is such a horrifying reality for us in this moment. I don't think I need to tell this community how worrisome this trend is. It really is a reflection of the disintegration, really the tearing apart of our national fabric. And I was speaking with a rabbinic colleague and friend this week who said, I am honestly far more concerned about November 4th than I am about November 3rd. And I know that he's not alone and I'm not alone, because many of us are holding incredible worry about what's going to happen in the days ahead and what, if anything, we can do to prepare for it. So I want to address it this morning, as hard as it is to have this conversation. And I want to start by inviting us to look at Dor Hamabul, the generation of the flood, and to think from this teaching that comes from Parshat Noach about what we might learn in this moment. So what was really the sin of this generation that was so awful that the entire civilization was destroyed? Our rabbis say that their sin was theft and murder and sexual violence. The language in the Torah is very clear. V'timaleh haaretz chamas, that the earth became corrupt before God, that the earth was filled with lawlessness. But what really is meant by that word chamas? The rabbis in Bereshit Rabbah contrast Hamas with another word called gezel. Both of them are really defined by a kind of lawless thievery. But here's what they say. So Rabbi Hanina teaches that Hamas is when you steal, but you steal just less than the amount that one would need to steal in order for it to be a prosecutable crime. So you're taking, but just a little bit less. And they give this example of what people used to do in the flood. So someone would go out to the market and they would try to sell baskets of legumes, of lupines. So then people would come over and they would steal from the person who's selling, but steal just less than what they could get arrested and prosecuted for. And then the next person would come over and they'd also steal just a little bit. And there would be no redress for the law, but ultimately that shopkeeper would have to go out of business because everything he had was taken from him. So Gezel is like full-fledged overt theft, but Hamas is taking a little bit less than that, but enough that if everyone did it, it would begin to destroy a person's livelihood and it would begin to destroy a society. So their sin really was that they took a little here, they took a little there, never enough to make a federal case of it. And the question is really, why is that bad enough that it justified God wanting to destroy the entire world? And the answer that the rabbis say is really interesting. The rabbis say it's because they took and they took and they took until the culture became a culture that accepted theft, until cheating your neighbor became normative. Most of the people on earth were doing it. And Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has this really interesting interpretation of it. He says, eventually, it's not even about what they were actually taking, which was almost a meaningless amount, but it was the fact that it became so widespread that theft began to define their society. There is a way in which small, petty cruelties with no recourse began to corrode the society from within, until the society stood at the edge of collapse. It destroyed the fabric of their society. And that strikes me as rather important for us today, because we are standing in the midst of an election season. It's not that we're 10 days away from election day. We're in election season. Nearly 50 million people have already voted. And this is the most contentious political environment, perhaps since the Civil War. And I'm really interested right now in what exactly it is that contributes to the downfall of a society. I'm interested in the journey to extreme polarization in a society when it progresses or regresses to the point that we are actually vulnerable to political violence. I really resonate to the warning that comes from the Midrash that it becomes through small, it begins through small, non-prosecutable acts of criminality, through the normalization of violent language, through tweeting and retweeting violent conspiracy theories, through minor acts and accusations that begin to undermine a sense of trust in one another and trust in our democratic processes, through test balloons sent out over time in order to suss out a society's openness to new norms, dangerous norms. These are the seeds that have been planted by nefarious actors in our midst. And they ultimately take root and they become normative in a society until we find ourselves living in an environment of widespread permissibility toward not only callousness and cruelty, but also violence. And in our Parsha, that's exactly what happened. But that's only the first failure. The second failure is that once that society had so deteriorated, nothing was done to stop the violence that was spawned by the violence. So God says to Noah the following. God says to Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. I'm about to destroy them. I'm about to destroy the earth. So make an ark, and here's how you're going to build it. And God says, I'm going to bring a flood. Waters will cover this earth. Every single living thing will be destroyed except for what you bring onto the ark. And then I'll establish my covenant with you. This is an unequivocal, uncompromising punishment. I will wipe out all of humanity, total destruction. And Noah's response is ken asa. Noah did exactly as God commanded him. So he did, it says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 19. We can't underestimate the power of those two words, ken asa, Noah's assent to God's plan for the destruction of the world. You know, our rabbis compare Noah to Abraham, who fought to save the innocent at Sodom and Gomorrah. And they compare him to Moses, who fought to save even the guilty Israelites. And they ask, why didn't Noah fight to save anyone outside his own family? We learn that of all the moral failings of Dora Mabul, of the generation of the flood, the one that Noah was guilty of was the sin of self-denigration. In the language of the Kedushat Levi in Parshat Noach, he says Noach was righteous and wholehearted, but he was small and he was insignificant in his own eyes. He did not believe in himself. He did not realize that he was a powerful tzaddik who could actually have averted the decree against the people. And on the contrary, he just saw himself just like everyone else in the generation. He said, I'm no better than anyone else. So if I'm going to be saved, they'll probably be saved too. And if not, there's nothing I can do about it. And as a result, says the Kedushat Levi, he did absolutely nothing to fight to avert the decree against humanity. And so many people died. Listen, this really matters to us today, because over the course of time, not only do petty cruelties, not only does petty callousness, small enough sins, not only do they become normative, but also our sense that we cannot effectively combat them becomes normative too. We suffer from protest fatigue, a sense of inevitability, a learned helplessness. We have no idea what the coming weeks and the coming months will hold. But I believe that the greatest danger that we face today is that we internalize that whatever you and I do will not ultimately matter. And I'm not only talking about voting right now, because yes, and yes, And yes, every single one of us needs to vote. If you haven't voted already, you must do so as soon as possible. If you need help making a plan to vote, please ask someone you trust and make a plan, because we have to get out and use our voices and vote. But I'm not only talking about voting. I'm talking about each of us and all of us being willing to do whatever is in our power to stand up to the destruction, the upheaval in our society that will likely take place in the days ahead, to step into that breach. Brooke Wirtschafter, our director of community organizing, and I were in a number of trainings this week. One of them with a young woman named Rachel Brown, who runs an organization called Under Zero. This was organized through the Lippman Camphor Foundation. And she was teaching about nonviolent civil disobedience and de-escalation in the event of political violence related to the upcoming election. And the question that we were asking is, what can we do to protect each other and to protect our democracy in the days ahead? And this is what Rachel said. She said that in times of extreme political strife and even violence, we, each of us, will be tested in our values and tested in our moral identity. Who are we? Who do we stand for? What are we willing to fight for? And the greatest danger is to believe, like Noach did, that there's nothing that we can do. But every one of us can do something. Regardless of the outcome of these elections, we will have to take action in the days ahead. And I want to tell you 3 things that I hope and pray that we will hold as we walk through the unknown right now. Number 1, the trainings in nonviolent civil disobedience and de-escalation tell us that the first and most important thing that we need to do is invest in community, build resiliency networks, because we can't do this alone. I wonder if Noach had talked to his wife, if he had brought her on board on his thinking, if she would have convinced him to broaden his commitments, to reach beyond what he needed to do to keep his family safe and find the courage to fight not only for their family, but for others as well, for humanity. In the days ahead, we have to build our networks. We have to ask, who are we connected to who might be targeted in this time? Who are we going to call if we are targeted? What influence do we have? What influence does our Jewish community have? The experts are advising us to take this week to open and to reopen lines of communication, to invest in adaptive, resilient networks so that we will be prepared for what might come in the days ahead. The second thing is that they call us to live deeply into our values. I really believe that Noach was a truly decent person. Ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav. He was a righteous and a pure man, but he did not stop the violence. Either before the flood, living in a society that was increasingly normalizing cruelty. And he didn't stop the violence once God promised to take destructive action against all of humanity. We are who we are. It's in this time that we have to live most deeply into our core values, into our Jewish identity, with a strong sense of our history and our shared purposes, with a strong sense of what is right and what is wrong, especially when the stakes are highest. And the third thing is that we're called to do something, to take agency, to take concrete action. This crisis led Noach to take refuge. He got busy building the ark and collecting the animals, and he did it with incredible love. But there was a battle that needed to be fought. It was a righteous, non-violent battle, and Noach opted out of it. We must not opt out of it. We may be called in the days ahead to use our voices and our resources and our bodies to fight and to stand up for the integrity of our democracy and for every vote counting. And we, you and I, need to answer that call safely and non-violently in whatever way we're able. I know that it's very hard to talk about all of this. And God willing, the days ahead will be days not of polarization and political violence and division, but days of healing and rebuilding. But the strategies of deepening our resiliency networks and building community, of living deeply into our values and honoring our agency by taking positive action, These are things that we're going to need to do to heal and to rebuild too. In the Haftarah, we read that the waters of the flood are referred to as Mei Noach, Noach's waters, meaning that flood was Noach's responsibility because he could have done more. It's on us now to make sure that our descendants don't one day look upon us the same way, saying you could have done more when it mattered most. Now's the time for us to be brave and to be decisive. Just as a society can be brought to the brink through the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant acts, we now also have to trust that a society can be saved through small, seemingly insignificant actions, the actions that you and I take in the days ahead. I pray that we all stay safe. May we all stay healthy, and may we be driven by a fierce, loving sense of fidelity to one another, to our tradition, and to the more perfect union that together we can build. I wish you Shabbat Shalom.